Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jovana Knežević, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at Stanford. It is my great pleasure today to introduce to you Kathryn Ciancia, Associate Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Ciancia is an historian of modern Eastern Europe with a research focus on Poland in the first half of the 20th century. And today she is presenting to us her first book entitled, as you see here on the screen, On Civilization's Edge, A Polish Borderland in the Interwar World. It was published in 2020, just last year, by Oxford University Press. It is a study that examines the activities of an eclectic group of Polish civilian and military men and women in their attempts to modernize and civilize, and she'll talk to us about what that means, a multinational post-imperial space in the borderlands of the Polish state. Her broader research interests include migration, and she is presently working on a transnational history that traces the relationship between the Polish interwar state and its citizens abroad, focusing on consulates. She teaches courses in Eastern Europe, mass violence, nationalism and transnationalism, and citizenship and migration, and employs innovative teaching methods in doing so. I feel that lastly, I need to mention that Dr. Ciancia received her doctorate in history from Stanford, and we are delighted to welcome her home today and just regret that it cannot be in person. But it is lovely to see you, and I think I speak for everyone in saying how excited we are to hear about your book.
Thank you so much, Jovana, for that lovely introduction. And yes, I'm absolutely delighted to be back at Stanford. I also wish that I was there in person. The weather is beginning to get nicer in Madison, but it's not Northern California nice yet. So I'm very sad that I can't be there, but this is the next best thing. And thank you to Chris for inviting me, to Jovana for inviting me. And thank you all for coming and you know, on this Friday afternoon and listening to me talk about my book. You know, it's wonderful to be back at Stanford. You know, I as Jovana said, I did my PhD at Stanford. I was very lucky to work under the guidance of Norman Naimark, sort of my advisor extraordinaire, and also to work with Kathryn Jollick, James Sheen, and Amir Viner on my committee, and also many other members of the faculty and my fellow graduate students. So the germination of this book really was at Stanford. So with the problem of Zoom fatigue very much in mind, I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes. I'll try and limit it so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers. And I'm looking forward to that sort of more dynamic part of the session. So I want to begin by talking about a photograph. And that's the photograph that I chose from the front cover of my book, which you see here. I remember getting to this stage in the book's production and being both sort of exhausted, but also elated that this book was going to become a book, a physical object which would have a photograph on its cover. And I naively assumed that this would be the cherry on the top, the kind of final flourish of this process of producing the book. But it actually turned out to be important and a really valuable intellectual exercise, thinking about what photograph would best encapsulate the arguments in the book, and really ultimately what this book was all about. So this is the front cover of the book. And I also want to show you the photograph, the original photograph, which was used to design the front cover. So without knowing any of the context of this photograph, and I'll get to that in a while, I want basically to describe what we can see here. Well, we have a family, dad, mom, grandma in the middle, a toddler on her lap, and the dog. And they're sitting outside their wooden cottage with its thatched roof. They wear a mixture of modern and more traditional clothes. Their shoes are modern, as is the cloth cap and the jacket worn by the man, but the headscarf suggests a more traditional aesthetic. Their body language suggests that they are comfortable in their environment. They look at ease. The adults look directly into the camera, smiles on their faces. The faces of the dog and the toddler are blurred. They cannot stay still long enough as the camera shutter opens and closes. And perhaps this photograph also represents something of my life at this moment. I have both a dog and a toddler and a preschooler as well. And I very much know that these creatures cannot stay still for very long. So it's a very human photograph, which was what appealed to me. But it also encapsulates a duality in my approach in the book, and one that exists, I would suggest, in all of our work as historians. So on the one hand, we try and capture the character of a place and a time that we cannot possibly visit in any literal sense. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in the book, and I hope to do in this presentation as well, is take readers to the villages and the towns and even the individual houses of the place that I'm focusing on. On the other hand, however, I'm very conscious of the fact that my sources frame these places in particular ways, whether literally, as is the case with a photograph, right? There are also things going on outside the boundaries of this framing, or more metaphorically in the case of the textual sources that I use in the book. And one of the things that actually strikes me about this particular source is that it is at once a snapshot of a place in a given moment, and also something of a modern trope, even a cliche, an idealized family sitting outside its well-run homestead. Indeed, there is not much that grounds this photograph in interwar Poland. Instead, it gestures to a much broader set of global references. So before I get back to what those global references are, or what I think they are, or how I present them in the book, let's start by asking and answering a few basic questions about this photograph. Who are these people? Where are they? And what are they doing here? Well, here we have the family of a Polish military settler. He's the man on the right-hand side of the picture. And the photograph was taken by a military photographer in a military settlement in the eastern borderlands of Poland in August 1924. So this photograph is almost 100 years old. They were here because the man had fought for the fledgling Polish army against Bolshevik Russia in the war of 1919 to 1920. And this was one of a series of borderland wars that erupted as the continental empires of the pre-war period, in this case, the Russian Empire collapsed, and a Polish state began to emerge in fits and starts on the map of Europe. As the fighting raged on, the Polish government in Warsaw had offered these men plots of land in the eastern borderlands once that war was over, a kind of reward for all of their work. And along with thousands of other men, this man had taken the government up on its offer in the early 1920s. And while veterans of this war moved to settlements across eastern Poland, this particular settlement was located in the province that received the largest single number of military settlers, and that province was called Valinia. Valinia is the Polish borderland of my book's title. You can see Valinia on these two maps. They both come from the book. They're from 1930. The map on the left shows Valinia as one of 16 administrative provinces in interwar Poland. And the map on the right is a sort of zoomed in map of Valinia. It shows the county towns, it shows the various counties that made up the province, shows some of the rivers, and sort of just gives you a general sense of the administrative structure of Valinia. So like many regions in Eastern Europe, Valinia was a classic borderland, a place in which borders had ebbed and flowed over time as states moved in and then retreated. Valinia had lent its name to a medieval principality, a province of the early modern Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and after the late 18th century partitions of that Commonwealth, a governorate in the Russian Empire. And if you look at a map today, you'll see that there is even an oblast in Ukraine named Volhynia. At the end of the First World War, as Russian imperial power imploded in Volhynia, it once again became a military battleground as a dizzying array of different forces, the Red Army, the Imperial White Army, short-lived iterations of an embryonic Ukrainian state, and of course, as I mentioned, the new Polish state fought for control. And as I mentioned, the military settlers whom we saw on the photograph had taken part in these conflicts. Ultimately, much, although not all of the area that had historically been considered Volhynia was absorbed into the Polish state, although some of it was ended up as part of the Soviet Union. The population of the Polish province that you see here reached around 2 million people in 1931, according to the census. They lived primarily in the countryside, although there were some small towns here, which you see, and they sprung up mainly along rivers. So what was Volhynia like? What did this place look like? Well, geographically, it was divided between the northern areas, which were akin geographically to Polessia, which is a region to the north. And you will see that marked on the map on the right-hand side. And these areas were low-lying, they were marshy, they were not particularly good for agriculture. People fished here, people, had reared animals here. And then you had the southern part, which was much more fertile, sort of gently undulating hills, much better for agriculture. Overall, however, Valinia was a very poor province. It was especially poor in the northern part, but it was generally considered to be poor throughout. Much of the land remained undrained, transportation networks were sparse, literacy rates were low. So by all of these indications of civilization, which I'm going to speak about in a moment, this was considered to be really low down compared to the other administrative provinces in Poland. So if at first glance, Valinia's status as a poor backwater suggests its lack of importance for historical study, my book, unsurprisingly perhaps, argues the opposite. Here, I want to make the case that it was precisely Valinia's perceived marginality, its backwater status, its provincialness, that makes it a critical location for understanding how ideas of backwardness and civilization came to be constructed and framed in the first place. And these were, of course, global questions too, which brings us back to the idea of the photo's global references. Like the other post-imperial states that emerged in Eastern Europe at the end of the First World War, which you see here in the map on the left-hand side, Poland occupied a rather precarious position within global hierarchies of civilization. These hierarchies were frequently conceptualized within temporal frameworks. The idea that some areas of the world were deemed to be more civilized, these were places that were living in the present moment, hurtling toward the future, while others lagged woefully behind, stagnating in the past, struggling to keep up. Now, Poles, by virtue of being European, were considered to be more civilized than many populations that lived in areas beyond Europe, particularly in colonial contexts where racial frameworks became entangled with ideas about civilization or backwardness. And yet, at the very same time, for the kinds of historical and cultural reasons that we're all familiar with, having read Larry Wolf's Inventing Eastern Europe, Poles were seen to be less civilized than their Western European counterparts. So to put it another way, Valinia was a backwater of Poland, and Poland was a backwater of Europe, but it was still Europe, and therefore seen to be more civilized than much of the world. Now, this liminal status lent Valinia a kind of double-edged quality. While Poles looked at it with feelings of anxiety and even disgust, as we'll see, Valinia simultaneously provided opportunities for Poles to prove their civilizational credentials at home and abroad. Now, what gives this story particular resonance, however, is that these questions about backwardness and civilization became intimately entangled with another set of questions that dominated the interwar period, in the colonial context, in the context of the mandates, and in the context of nation states. Which nations deserve to rule over other nations? We go back to our map of Valinia. Valinia was part of the Polish state, as I mentioned, but its ethnically Polish population remained a minority, and a small minority at that. Only 17%, 17% of the total population of Valinia was Polish. This is according to the Poles' own statistics from the 1931 census. These were normally Roman Catholics, but on that census, they used the criterion of mother tongue, so the language spoken at home as the criterion for nationality. So 17% Polish, so it's a really pretty small minority. Ukrainian speakers, usually Orthodox Christians, usually living in the countryside, constituted 68%, and Jews speaking Yiddish or more rarely Hebrew, usually living in small towns, were 10% of the population. There were also smaller percentages of Czechs, Germans, and Russian speakers as well. So understandably, perhaps, studies of Valinia, with the way that historians have thought about it, have traditionally prioritized questions about the state's official position toward these different non-Polish groups. They've asked questions like, was Poland good or bad for its national minorities? What were relations like between national groups? And in trying to answer these questions, they've often looked at certain types of sources: laws, decrees, constitutions, political reports that often group the reports according to these different national groups. But what struck me when I began researching Valinia actually is that there was a lot less talk about national minorities per se, and much more about how ideas of civilizational development affected how people saw these different national groups and indeed constructed these national groups. And this actually included the way that they thought about local Poles, as well as the ways in which they thought about Ukrainians and Jews and these other groups. My best sources, I found, were not those that were filed away neatly under these national, sort of explicitly national headings, but actually those that were not. I scoured newspaper articles, public health reports, minutes of local meetings, and photographic collections that allowed me to look at these questions from the side on rather than head on. So who were the Poles that created the kind of sources that really got me excited when I got into this project? Who were the Poles who created sources that allow us not only to reconstruct life in Valinia in the interwar period, but also to understand how Valinia itself was constructed? Well, in some ways, it's easier to say initially who they were not. So I'm not looking primarily in this project at people in Warsaw, people who are devising policy, Polish politicians. It's not a Warsaw-centric book. In fact, it really tries to decenter Warsaw. So I'm not looking at those people on the sort of the very top. But I'm also not looking at the ordinary people of the province, whatever that means, right? So this is also not a kind of bottom-up history of the region. Rather, the people I'm interested in, I conceive of as second-tier actors. This is the best way I found to talk about this analytical category. And these were men and women who either directly or indirectly represented the interests of the Polish state in Valinia, and who were united in their use of ideas of civilization, sometimes in quite complicated and even conflicting ways, to make a case for their own importance. So let me just give you a few examples from the pictures that you see here. So I was very interested in border guards, and you see them in the picture in the top right-hand side here. These are people who not only patrolled in a military sense the very volatile eastern border with the Soviet Union, but also people who saw it as their job to go out into these communities and to try and teach people to behave in a civilized way. And again, I'll say a little bit more about what that means in a moment. I was interested in boy and girl scouts, and this is the image that you see in the bottom middle here. These are Girl Scouts who are at a camp in the summer. They would go out and camp at these border guard outposts, and they would spend 6 weeks or 8 weeks there, not only working with border guards, but also working with the local people and trying to improve their lives in whatever way they saw fit. I was also interested in military settlers, and you can see that the picture again, sort of in the bottom left-hand side of the screen. These are people whose settlements were supposed to provide some kind of model for local populations to show rural people, this is how you can live if you have this sense of civilization. Academics and scholars of the region, two of whom you see in the top left-hand corner, and also members of philanthropic societies, like the ones you see on the bottom right here. This is a philanthropic society in Poznan in Western Poland, which had formerly been part of the German Empire. And they're sending boxes of books emblazoned with the Polish eagle out to their beleaguered cousins in the East. There are also groups that I included in the book that are not pictured here. Engineers who developed sewage systems for the towns, public health workers who became very frustrated when villagers would not quarantine when they became ill with an infectious disease, a part of the book whose resonance I had no idea would become so important when I wrote it. And elementary school teachers who taught academic subjects in the local schoolhouse, but also saw their job as teaching children basic hygiene, like washing their hands. So these people were not primarily thinking about civilization in terms of lofty appeals to high culture. This was civilization with a small c, as expressed through people's everyday customs and living conditions, through what they looked like, and as I get to in the book, even what they smelled like. And in their different ways, these second-tier actors believed that importing civilization would both strengthen Polish state power here and prove that the Poles, despite their minority status in terms of demographics, were the only force capable of bringing the region safely into the modern world. What I found most interesting was that this was never a straightforward process. And while I frame these people within a single analytical category, that of the second-tier actor, they often didn't agree on what this should mean, or indeed what Polishness meant in Volhynia. As I show in the book, there are all kinds of clashes between people who self-identify as Polish, between Polish military settlers and local Polish-speaking populations who don't like the military settlers because despite the military settlers' claim that they are coming in to recolonize the region, perceive these people as foreigners who are coming in to take their land. Between Polish Roman Catholic priests and Polish school teachers who have very different views about the role of the Catholic Church in the schoolhouse, and between Poles from Poznan, like the ones that you see here on the bottom right, who believe that by virtue of their experience in the German Empire, they are more civilized than people in Warsaw who were raised in the conditions of the Russian Empire. And throughout the interwar years, their ideas change. Their attitudes are complicated. They often fluctuate back and forth between different ideas about Valinia. They think about the region as disgusting and as beautiful, as mired in eternal backwardness, and as experiencing modernization far too quickly, as foreign and as exotic, as becoming less Polish, which they're very worried about. There's all of these anxieties in the 1920s that it's less Polish than it was before the war, which that causes great anxiety, and integrating more fully into the state. So they go back and forth between these positions. So I can't relate everything, of course, that I lay out in the book to you today. But what I'd like to do is spend the rest of my presentation focusing on how some of these second-tier actors married ideas about civilizational development and Polishness in Valinia between the late 1920s and the mid-1930s. This is the middle period that I cover in the book. And the reason I think it's so interesting is because historians have in some ways come to a sort of consensus about this period. They argue that this was the period in which Polish nationalism was the most inclusive. They argue that it is a time at which there's a sort of alternative vision of the Polish nation, which is offered to Ukrainians and Jews, and which sort of welcomes them in to this more civic-minded idea, very different from the integral nationalism, the ethnic nationalism of the Polish right. And while I think this periodization is correct in a sort of broad sense, looking at the types of sources that I look at, these sources that get at these questions, again, from the side on, rather than just kind of going with the grain of the archival sources, reveals actually that the more inclusive version of Polish nationalism was itself prescribed, limited, and very much based on what constituted an acceptable form of diversity. It was inclusive, but it was exclusive in its own way. So I want to give some examples of this, and I'm going to start by talking about the Ukrainian Orthodox population and the different ways in which they were framed according to this more inclusive vision of the Polish nation. And as I mentioned, the Ukrainian Orthodox, even according to the statistics that the Poles collected, were the majority population here. So if we're thinking about ideas of national self-determination, Ukrainians actually have a very clear claim to this region. So in almost all of my sources, Polish second-tier actors depicted Ukrainians as backward, and in particular as having a kind of cyclical relationship with their environment. The logic went something like this. Muddy and swampy conditions created slovenly and apathetic people, and those apathetic and slovenly people continued to live in muddy and swampy conditions. So there's a sense of kind of the cyclical relationship where people and land reinforce one another. And this photograph, which comes from the Illustrated Daily Courier, which is a Kraków-based newspaper in interwar Poland, this image comes from alongside an article from 1934. And I want to emphasize that this is not an atypical image from this region. We see this in many of the reports and the written sources that I look at in the book. So for instance, there are sources from the border guards where they talk, again, in the early 1930s, about this disgust that they feel about local people allowing animals to live in their houses. Or there's a report from a teacher who says there's a local joke among Poles that the reason that the air is so clean in Volhynia is because the peasants never open their windows. So they're sort of saying, well, they never ventilate their houses, so they are, that shows a lack of civilization. And if they were to do so, all of that putrid air would come out and actually pollute the environment more broadly. So this is by no means an anomaly. This is very much representative of a certain way of looking at this region. And what I want to do is to put this image next to the image that I had on the front cover of the book, And what I think we can see then are the ways in which these images work well together. I think it's also interesting to point out that this image is from 1934. So it's actually 10 years after the image that I use on the front of the book. But it seems to be, in terms of that temporal framework of backwardness and civilization, it seems to be coming from something earlier, if we're thinking chronologically. So if we put them next to each other, I think we see sort of the perfect counterpoint of the different symbols in these pictures in each of them. So on one level, there's something similar here, right? I mean, we can compare the pictures. They both have a person or people standing outside what we presume to be where they live. But it's largely where the similarities end. So on the left-hand side, on the photograph of the woman from Sarnia County, we see windows with no panes in them compared to the paned windows on the right-hand side. We have a ramshackle house made of logs rather than evenly cut pieces of wood. We have mud on the ground rather than the sort of the smooth ground in front of the settler's house. We have a dirty apron rather than the impossibly clean one on the grandma on the settler photograph. We have traditional boots that lace up the leg rather than the more modern shoes. The body language suggests a sort of her feeling uncomfortable. It's almost like she's been kind of forced to pose in front of this house, which is, I think, very different from the ease with which the settlers' families sit outside of their homestead. And I also think it's important that the woman is alone. She's not part of a traditional family. And I think this says a lot about the role that women were expected to play here. Even the caption that accompanied the photograph in the newspaper undermined her presence. You might remember that it read, "A poor Valinian hut in Sarnia County." So it's not actually focused on the woman, it's focused on the environment. She's almost kind of erased from the photograph in that sense. So put simply, each photograph exists as a counterpoint to the other photographs. They make a perfect pair, the civilized Poles and the uncivilized Ukrainian. But the story is not that simple. At the same time, almost exactly the same time as these sort of images of backwardness are circulating, many second-tier actors simultaneously curated and valorized a version of local Ukrainian identity, one that was rooted in Valinia rather than alien or foreign to it. And as I said about that previous photograph, she seems to look so uncomfortable in her environment, as if she really doesn't belong there. So the Valinian Provincial Museum, for instance, which opened its doors in 1929 amidst an obsession with all things regional, displayed folkloric costumes, portraits of peasants, and traditional dyed eggs known as pisanki in both Polish and Ukrainian. You can see a photograph from the museum on the right-hand side. You can also see here a map of the infrastructure of Valinia, which a Valinian Tourist Association published in the 1930s as part of a broader effort to encourage tourists to visit. There was a real push in the 1930s to try and turn Valinia into a place where tourists would want to visit. It was largely unsuccessful. It doesn't have the mountains of the Carpathians or the coastline of the Baltic. I mean, or the lakes. It really doesn't have what the more attractive areas of Poland for tourism had, but they made this effort to do so, and this was part of that. And what I think is really interesting about this image is that it marries the idea of a more modern transportation network of train lines and roads, for instance, with these much more traditional, even exoticized versions of Ukrainian peasants. It presents Ukrainians, in other words, as an integral part of the Valinian project, but only if they were stripped of their unattractive backwardness, and that backwardness was replaced or reframed as something exotic. Now, this simultaneous criticism of non-Polish populations for their backwardness and the celebration of local exoticism was also reflected in the framing of Valinia's Jews. While the more inclusively minded Polish administration in Valinia between the late 1920s and the mid-1930s certainly opposed the rabid anti-Semitism of the Polish right, what I saw in the sources actually is that we shouldn't let them off so easily, because they simultaneously argued that towns, for instance, where the vast majority of Valinia's Jews lived, needed to be de-Jewified. So this is an idea that Jews were also backward. It's very different from simultaneous ideas circulating in much of Western Europe that Jews represent this sort of corrosive form of modernity. Here they're very much framed within the backwardness paradigm. It's different from the paradigm in which Ukrainians are framed. Here, what we have is the idea that Jews, much more so than Ukrainians, are linked to the Russian Empire's backwardness. And they're also accused of a kind of deliberate rejection of Polish modernity in favor of their narrow economic interests. So it's not the same, but I think this shows the flexibility of these categories of backwardness and civilization, that they can kind of be shaped around these different populations, and that they can come to take on these local meanings. Poles attributed the dirty, smelly conditions of the towns, where people apparently drowned in mud as they tried to get to their apartments. There's a lot of very sort of almost over the top newspaper articles where the problems of the towns are laid out in these very dramatic ways. And so they attributed this to incompetent Jewish urban governance. And these settlements translated into policies by which Polish officials sought, and indeed did, dissolve town councils, which they saw as being dominated by Jews. And they also pressed for policies by which the town borders would be expanded. And this would bring Christian populations who lived on the outskirts of the town into the towns, and they would presumably then vote for other Christian populations for the town councils, which would dilute Jewish influence. And this is the kind of language that they're using, trying to get rid of Jewish influence. There were even attempts to build so-called Polish urban colonies that would represent a version of civilized European modernity in the midst of Jewish space. And this is an example of that they wanted this to look like. So this is a plan of a colony for state officials. They called it a colony, which I think is kind of interesting language from the mid-1920s. And it was based on the Garden City movement of urban development. And they basically wanted this area of the town to have everything that the town in general lacked. So it would have, running water, a sewage system, tree-lined streets, regularly built houses with their own backyards. It was supposed to be a kind of microcosm of European civilization and modernity in the middle of what they saw as a Jewish town. As was the case with discussions of Ukrainians, however, the very same people who criticized Jews as dirty, backward, and uncivilized simultaneously latched onto certain aspects of what they saw as Jewish identity and fetishized a version of Jewishness that they believed could be accommodated and even promoted in a local vision of the Polish nation. So one way this happens, and the way that I'm going to talk about it, relates to architecture, and in particular synagogues. So these were the areas of the sort of Jewish buildings that were most remarked upon in a positive way in tourist guidebooks to the region. And again, tourism was not huge here, but tourist guidebooks actually are really interesting sources to think about what people are focusing on and the kind of historical narratives that they're trying to promote. So this is an image of the Great Synagogue in Łódź, which was the capital, the provincial capital of Valinia. And it had been originally constructed in the early part of the 17th century. So this sort of older version of Polish history could be talked about in relation to this synagogue. Polish regionalist magazines discussed how it was architecturally similar to other non-Jewish sites in the town. And so it fit in that sense into a kind of intra-urban architectural style, that it was grounded in this place, that it wasn't foreign to the place, but it sort of fit in to a more general architectural style in this particular town. There was also praise for a very different kind of synagogue in Łódź, which obviously just looks very different from the previous one. And this was used by the tiny population of non-rabbinical Karaite Jews in Łódź. It's called a Knesset. And this population was extremely small. It was just 65 people or 12 families who lived in the town. And in contrast here to emphasizing the kind of monumental architectural style that they did in relation to the Great Synagogue, Polish regionalists praised the Karaites for having created an architectural site that they believed was both Jewish and quintessentially Polish. So in the first guidebook, the first sort of full guidebook to Valinia, which was published in the late 1920s, a photograph of the Knesset was accompanied by a brief description of the building, and it was described as, and I quote, a curious specimen of Polish architecture. So the wooden synagogue was Polish as well as Jewish. Again, however, this was a narrative about Jews being rooted here and not foreign. But we have to remember it was one that was contained in a guidebook, which also criticized Valinian towns as being too Jewish in their aesthetic. And here they're referring to things like, a cramped market square or, muddy areas of the town. So they're sort of talking about the negative aspects as they see it of Jewish space, but they also talk about this being quintessentially Polish. So again, you have this idea that Jewishness, if controlled, can become part of the Polish project. But otherwise it's antithetical to Polishness. So what can we conclude from some of these observations? Well, I want to make 3 points in summary, and then, as I said, I look forward to a broader discussion of some of the things that I've said, and also, things that I haven't been able to mention in my presentation. So the first thing to really emphasize is that this is a story that is both global and local. On the one hand, none of these dynamics operated outside of the global frameworks of civilization and backwardness, understood, as I mentioned, as kind of a timeline in which some nations are going forward into the future and others are lagging behind. Such ideas were central to questions of interwar sovereignty and nationalism in Valinia as across the world. And as I try to show, these second-tier actors thus utilized a much broader set of ideas about what civilization meant and who had the right and the ability to usher a region from backwardness to civilization. It's also, however, a very local story. As second-tier actors constructed concepts of civilization in ways that advanced their own local agendas in Volhynia. So I want to really emphasize that I'm trying to think about both of those levels at the same time. Second, this is a story about the limits of inclusion, even when we talk about the inclusive nationalist framework. While Polish historiography has sometimes lauded this more positive view of the nation, and I understand why, because we know what the alternative looked like, and we also know what came next in this region, after 1939. Polish second-tier actors who espoused the more inclusive version of nationalism still saw Ukrainians and Jews as less civilized, albeit in different ways. And I think this realization helps us to think and move beyond the binary of inclusive and exclusive understandings of the nation. And this way of thinking about nationalism goes far beyond the Polish case, this idea that there's this sort of binary between inclusive and exclusive. It forces us to ask questions such as, what did inclusion really mean? What were people being included in? On what basis and on whose terms? And finally, I argue that the most important dynamics in interwar Volhynia are not really about relations between national groups. This is an analytical framework that assumes that such groups existed out there in the world to be studied, and ones that often, our sources kind of reify that idea because we find those groups compartmentalized in the sources that I talked about a little bit earlier. Rather, this is a story about how a particular group of self-declared Poles constructed ideas about what it meant to be Polish and civilized in a region that they saw as being neither of those things. As much as I try and bring in multiple voices in the book, and I'm happy to talk about that a bit more in the Q&A, my book really doesn't claim to represent some kind of Ukrainian or Jewish perspective, whatever that might mean. Instead, it is about the ways in which Poles framed those people and how in doing so, they ultimately frame themselves. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the questions very much.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. I think you've given us all a lot of food for thought. And I invite you now to pose your questions in the Q&A, which you can do by typing them in. I will be moderating the questions, posing them to Kathryn, and let's start with one question that has come in that references Peter Judson's work, The Habsburg Empire, A New History, where he argues that the fall of the Habsburg Empire led to the numerous nation states that arose to act often as mini empires. In the sense that they had similar institutions, administrators, and views on forming states driven by a unifying process. Also, the Habsburgs themselves had viewed Galicia at some point as an experiment to which Austrian or German civilization should be projected. So the question is, to what extent do you see the Polish policies towards Bohemia as a continuation of Habsburg civilizing practices?
That's a really great question. Thank you. And I think it's worth mentioning that one of the things that I'm really interested in with this book is thinking about this idea of empire and what it means. And I went back and forth a lot about what to call these sets of processes that were going on in relationship to the East. And people have called them imperial, and absolutely right that in Judson's epilogue he talks about why are we thinking about this as not empire? Is it just because we're following the ways in which these nation states deliberately want to define themselves against empire? So we're just sort of falling into the trap of following their narrative. So I think that's a really interesting perspective. Ultimately, what interested me, however, was not my own claim as to whether this was an imperial project or not, because I felt that as soon as you kind of get into that, you just end up with different definitions of what an empire is, and you start to pick and choose. Well, it sort of has this that kind of looks like an empire, but then this aspect that doesn't. And I actually found that question less interesting than thinking about the ways in which the Poles were conceiving of empire and thinking about what empire meant to them. And the fine line that the Poles have to walk here is that they, on one level, they don't want to be accused of being imperialists. In the sense, their whole nation state is defined as an anti-imperial project. And they come from this this history of having been conquered and colonized and so on. And they also recognize that in post-imperial Wilsonian Eastern Europe, that's not going to get you very far. At the same time, there are many things about this project that sort of look and smell like imperialism. And I think that's a lot of what Peter Judson is getting at there. In terms of thinking about the comparisons to Galicia, it's a really good point. The project actually, I don't know if Norma remembers this, but the project actually started off, I was going to do Galicia and Valinia, and I ended up just doing Valinia and sort of leaving out the Galician part. But there's a similar dynamic in that for the Austrians, Galicia was sort of the backwater and a place to civilize, and many of the same things, right? If you compare it to Vienna, just as if you compare Valinia to Warsaw, it's lacking lots of things. And one of the words that came up so much in my sources was this word brak, which in Polish means lack. So it's a lack of this, a lack of that. It's missing all of these things that you would expect there to be. And I think that's very similar to what was happening in Galicia. At the same time, Galicia is seen as more civilized than Valinia. And so there's a kind of internal hierarchy within Poland, much of it based on the different empires and the imperial policies. As I mentioned, Poznan was seen as more civilized because it was had been part of the German Empire. Galicia was seen as more civilized than Valinia because it had been part of the Austrian part of the Habsburg Empire. And so, Galicia certainly was seen as backward, but it wasn't seen as backward as Valinia. And so part of this is also thinking about the ways in which different empires have different legacies here, and how people also claim those legacies when they're thinking about their role in this new state. So thank you. This is a really great question, and as you can tell, it's a question that has kind of a lengthy and quite complicated answer.
So another question was posed by Kathryn Jollick, is that since many of the second-tier Poles that you talk about came to the region after World War I, can you talk about how they viewed the local Poles? Did they see them as backward and uncivilized?
Yeah, I'm really, thank you, Kathryn, for raising this question, because I was thinking about how I would integrate this in the talk, and I sort of ran out of time. So thank you for allowing me to talk a bit about it. So essentially, one of the main arguments of the book is that although I've presented these parts of the book that really focus on how did they frame Ukrainians and Jews, but actually a lot of this is really about the tensions between different visions of Polishness and the ways in which different groups define themselves as Polish. And so a lot of that actually did relate to the relationships between incoming Poles and people who they identified as Polish, but they didn't think of, partly because of this class dynamic, they didn't think of as and perhaps as nationally conscious as they would have liked. So, I briefly gave one example of this in the talk, but I can talk a little bit more about it, which is the Polish military settlers. So they come into the region, And their entire narrative is built around the idea that they are renationalizing the area, that they are bringing it back to its original Polishness. But the local people, they don't want people to come in and take the land from them. They think that this land belongs to them. And this has generally been told as a story of Ukrainians versus Poles. But there's also a sort of intra-Polish dynamic here, whereby Polish Catholics also want the land to belong to them. They don't want the land taken from them. And they see these people as coming in and taking that land. So when we look at things like land, policies related to land reform and land distribution, we can see that actually being Polish doesn't necessarily mean that you're natural allies, because all of these other things, they're actually more important for people, because they're much more about, sort of bread and butter sort of dynamics in the region. So that would just be kind of one example of that. And yes, there are also other examples of the local Polish people, Polish-speaking populations, Catholics, also being seen as uncivilized by these people coming in. And so again, it's part of it. What I'm trying to do is, rather than accept that there are Poles and Ukrainians and Jews, to think about the ways in which we can kind of disaggregate that idea of the Pole, and think about how during this period when so much is up in the air and so many people are kind of struggling for power and for land and for other resources in the region, that there are different claims as to what Polishness really means. And there's similar things related to the Polish landowners, who have a very different conception of civilization, much more rooted in the sort of the manor house and this idea about the sort of mythical past, versus this more technocratic idea about civilization, which is the one that I'm focusing on in the book.
We've had a couple of more questions come in from students. One focuses on while the Jews and Ukrainians were portrayed as backwards, was their very existence in the borderland considered to be problematic from the perspective of national security, for example, or was the region's diversity accepted, taken for granted? The other question has to do with the position of women in Bohemia in this period. And did this change over time or interact at all with the civilizing and modernizing project that you're discussing?
Okay, yeah, these are both really good questions. So the first question was about sort of, was the diversity taken for granted? And I can actually look at it, I can actually read it as well. So they were portrayed as backward. Yes. Yeah, was their existence sort of considered problematic in and of itself? I think at least early on, there were not policies to try and to remove these populations. So, there were different ideas in Poland about how far the eastern border should go. There were debates about, how many people who were not Polish should be integrated into the state. Could people be assimilated? There were different answers related to Ukrainians who, even those on the right believe there could be some assimilation, whereas they rejected the idea entirely of Jewish assimilation. So, there were ideas that there had to be some way of integrating these populations, particularly with these more civic nationalists, the ones that I've been focusing on in this talk. This begins to change definitely by the later part of the 1930s, but even by the mid 1930s, and this is something that I talk about in the last chapter of the book, where I really focus on the different research institutes and the ways in which they're categorizing people. So certainly there's a shift to the right in the mid to late 1930s. There are many more schemes that really push for Jewish emigration. So the idea is that there's no place for Jews here, that they would have to emigrate, that they're very, like she said, the sort of very presence is problematic. This is often, people have often focused on this from the point of view of the sort of the right-wing anti-Semites. But what I was really interested in are the ways in which those people connected, again, with this more inclusive idea about Polish nationalism, also began to talk about the fact that, that Jews would have to leave. And what they're doing there, they're deliberately distancing themselves from sort of the Catholic anti-Semitism and what they see as kind of irrational anti-Semitism. And they're saying, you know, just when we look at the numbers, they're very focused on demography. When we look at the numbers, we see that this is just unsustainable, and therefore we're going to have to find a way of getting these people to leave. They think, I mean, they frame it as a very rational. I mean, of course, it's they're talking about human beings, and none of what they're writing about implies that they're talking about human beings. It's all very kind of technocratic, sort of very scientific and based on, you know, surplus populations, and the language is really very sort of scientific in the way that they frame it. But there's sort of a building consensus by the late 1930s that the diversity itself is problematic. In terms of the Ukrainian population, they take a different approach. And what ends up happening with the Ukrainians is that they don't focus so much on pushing those people out of the borders, but on reconceptualizing them not as Ukrainian, but as Ruthenian. So the regionalist project that I talked about, these idealized Ukrainians, that was based on the idea that Ukrainians may be inferior to Poles, but they are Ukrainians, that there is such a thing as a Ukrainian. And what we have in the later part of the period that I'm looking at, definitely by the mid to late 1930s, there's a real emphasis on the idea that these people are not really Ukrainians at all. They are Ruthenians, they're proto-Poles, they are former Poles who, you know, during the Russian imperial period became convinced that they were Ukrainian as some kind of false consciousness, but that if you kind of scratch the surface, there's really a Pole underneath. And this gives the scientific justification for things like forced conversions, or in the eyes of the people doing it, reconversion or conversion back to Catholicism from Orthodoxy or Greek Catholicism, which were the religions associated with Ukrainians here and in Galicia as well. So there you see, I think, the idea that diversity itself is a problem. The period that I've been focusing on in this talk, diversity is sort of celebrated, but again, it's only celebrated according to very specific parameters of what that diversity can look like. So I hope that sort of answers the question. In other words, it changes over time. There's not sort of one answer for the entire period. And then the question about women is really important. And again, that's not something I talk too much about. So I'm glad that I have the opportunity to say a few words about that. You know, Ukrainian women in this region are really seen as sort of doubly uncivilized. They're not necessarily seen as dangerous as Ukrainian men, in the sense that they're not so much connected with things like communism and overtly political activity. But part of what I'm arguing in the book is that we really need to think more broadly about what politics means here. And that, you know, politics can mean all of these different things to do with material culture and people's behavior on an everyday level. And that states work best when we're not just talking about elections or, you know, other sort of more overtly political things, but we're talking about the behavior of citizens, and particularly near a border where people are crossing back and forth all the time in the 1920s. And that's seen, even if they're not doing something which is deliberately subverting the state, the very fact that they're ignoring a state border is seen to be kind of a subversive political act, even if they don't perceive it in those terms. So women are seen, you know, women's literacy rates, for example, are lower than men's. There are lots of concerns about the ways in which women don't use midwives, proper midwives for the birth, you know, for the birth of children in the villages. There are sort of old women who do that, who've sort of always done that work. So that's seen as a problem. They're criticized for the way that they don't feed their children properly. They're criticized for not wanting their children to go to school and kind of resisting the state's attempts to try and educate children. So women are seen, because of this different way of framing politics, women, Ukrainian Orthodox women in particular, are seen as dangerous. I would say as well, when we're thinking about Polish women, there is also a space that opens up in this broader definition of politics that allows women in as part of the civilizing mission in the East. Women are really underrepresented in traditional politics, in terms of political parties, in terms of, you know, there's very, very few women in any of the sort of local administration. I don't think I actually came across any in the sources that I looked at, but they can often do some of this other kind of work without seeming like they're doing anything political. So, you know, nurses, there are these female philanthropic organizations, there are classes about how to look after children and so on. So it both In other words, it makes the Ukrainian women political in a negative way, but it also opens up space for Polish women, particularly sort of middle-class women, to identify as part of this Polish project without seeming to encroach upon traditional male politics.
We've had a number of additional questions come in as you were responding. A couple of them have to do with the land. So one question simply poses, whether land was confiscated from older inhabitants, particularly by military settlers. Mm-hmm. The other one has to do more with land reform, which was an ethnically loaded problem. And was land distribution to the local peasantry more of a danger to the Polish land holdings? Mm-hmm. Was it a way of binding them with the state and perhaps the nation?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I sort of partly, I think, sort of address some of these questions in thinking about the intra-Polish tensions, because, if we're thinking, again, we get a little myopic, I think, when we only think about everything being a national question. And when we think about land, it actually means that there's certainly overlap, because there are so many Ukrainian-speaking peasants and there are Polish landowners here, but it's not quite so simple. So I think this issue of land is really important. What's really interesting is that the military settlers actually find that they have two major opponents locally. And they are the Polish-speaking landowners who also don't want land reform, and the peasantry. So we think in this region about, the natural conflict would be between the landowners and the peasants. And of course, there had been conflict between those different groups, including during the First World War. But actually, the military settlers in some ways make the dynamic more interesting, because they come in and neither the landowners nor the peasants want to. The landowners don't want to give up their land, and there's lots of cases of corruption, of landowners trying to bribe the authorities to mean that military settlers won't take their land. There are lots of accusations that the military settlers are really are also not very civilized. So there are some great complaints about these people who, as they're building the settlements, are often living in old abandoned manor houses. And there's some reports from the early 1920s where the landowners complain that these people, that they're living in these manor houses, but they're really, making them, they're putting hay on the floor, and that they're smashing things up, and that the windows are knocked out, and that they actually are not representing the best of Polish culture and civilization, but they're actually pretty uncivilized themselves. So all of these dynamics of, the Polish settlers are the civilizers, the landowners then sort of push back against that and say, actually, they're coming in and they're not civilized at all, but they're really wrecking the symbols of Polishness in this region. So it's kind of a very interesting dynamic, and it makes for a very complicated story, but I think one that's much more interesting than one that's, again, based purely on nationality. And then land reform, again, this is sort of bound up with this question. Certainly many Polish landowners have to give up their land. This happens across Poland and across Eastern Europe in the wake of the First World War. There are still, it doesn't happen immediately. And even by the 1930s, there are still some vestiges of the old feudal system here. And that was also something that I found really interesting. So even if there's been considerable land reform, you still have things like the servitudes, which, allow peasants to, go onto like a landowner's property and forage for food and so on, or have their cattle grazing on that land. And one of the things that the modern Polish state wants to do is to get rid of those things, because they're seen as again, vestiges of a feudal system as opposed to a modern democratic or, sort of modern, more capitalist based system. So again, even when you have land reform, even when you have things that seem to be modernizing the state, these vestiges still exist. And what's really interesting is that it's often the peasants who are resisting those kind of changes. So they're trying to do it, they think they're trying to do it on behalf of the peasantry to kind of make them modern, but you actually have people who resist that because they want that system to continue. They see certain benefits within that system.
We have another set of questions now having to do with language and definition of groups, and also sort of how these groups perhaps live together in the present day. So the first question having to do with languages, did you see the development in the course of your research of labels or epithets for the varying groups in Polish, in Ukrainian, in Yiddish, to describe the local Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish populations, as well as the population of Polish settlers? And how were these labels used to establish or bolster group identities, as well as ideas of the other? A related question asks more about the end of this period that you study, whether you observed that groups became more self-conscious or aware of their particular quote unquote nationality, and whether there were more commonly accepted definitions of the different nationalities by the end of the period.
Okay. These are really good questions. And, you know, I think the question of labels and what people are called is really, just in general, is really important. And it's, you know, I find myself struggling sometimes to think like, what should I call these people? Because every time you talk about them as Ukrainians or, you know, Ruthenians or Poles, there's a sort of implication that you are embracing that indeed all of these people have this full national consciousness. And of course, we know from, you know, the literature that's become so important about national indifference and, you know, over the past 15 to 20 years, that we shouldn't be making any of those assumptions. And I think that this idea about, you know, change over time is really important as well. So a poll, you know, in 1920 and a poll in 1939, are we actually talking about the same thing? So if I take the second question first about what changes, you know, a lot of what I'm looking at is actually not answering the question of how far these people by the end of the period really identified as Ukrainian or as Polish or as Jewish or as Czech or German. You know, that I feel like that's in a sense sort of beyond the questions that I'm asking. And maybe I should have done more of that, but I really wanted to stick to what I thought the sources that I had could tell me. This is really a Polish focused project. It really looks at the ways in which these Poles are conceiving of these things. I know that there has been work done on that. Olga Linkiewicz's work on Interwar Galicia really takes a kind of ethnographic approach to this and thinks about people's identities. In a way, this is not really a project about sort of the multiple identities in the region. And so I'm not sure I can say, like, did a Ukrainian necessarily feel more Ukrainian in 1939 than they did in 1935 or 1930? But what I can say is that the labels that the state was providing for them were changing. And I think that's really important. I don't know if it made them feel, you know, more or less Ukrainian or taking on other identities, but it did mean that there were certain identities that the state provided for them that they would then have to kind of slot themselves into. And again, I would focus on that. What changes in terms of thinking about Ukrainian? So, you know, people talk about Ruthenians. Again, Ruthenian was often a term that the Poles used when they wanted to suggest that this was not a fully developed national identity. And that has all kinds of ramifications, because if you don't accept somebody as a full member, you know, a member of a fully formed nation, then you're also, it's so much easier to deny them claims to political sovereignty or autonomy, because if you're living in a period where you need to be able to have a bona fide nation in order to have a state, or even to have national rights within a state, then if you're merely an ethnic group, it's much easier to say, well, actually, you don't deserve those rights. So this has, in other words, these are not just, I think as the first question implied, these are not just, these terms really matter in terms of the politics of this region. So, you know, as I said, they talked initially about Ruthenians and Ukrainians. Those on the right tended to use the term Ruthenian more, and those who wanted this more you know, integral, inclusive idea about Polish nationalism said, well, you can be a Ukrainian and a Pole at the same time. We can accept you as having this other national identity because you have a civic identity as Poles. And this is part of a much broader, you know, set of conversations about Polish identity. But by the late 1930s, there is this shift back to thinking about these people as Ukrainians. And one thing that's interesting, and again, I found this in the sources, and maybe this gives some answer to the question, although I don't think it gets to the question of genuine identity, but it gets to this question about the performativity, if you like, of some of this stuff. is that with these mass conversions that happened, and these were forced conversions that the border guards and other Polish institutions carried out in the late 1930s, that this was premised on the idea that these people were Ruthenians and not true Ukrainians, because, as I said, they were kind of they were proto-Poles. Again, if you scratch the surface, there's a Pole underneath. And these people, if you look at the archival documents, some of them actually start to talk in this language. They say, "Oh, thank you, for bringing us back to our original, religion of our ancestors." And so they're sort of instrumentalizing this language. Now, my instinct would not be to then make an argument that they really feel like, "Oh, yes, we just realized that we're Polish," but that there are certain things that go with. This is a very coercive policy, and there are things that you can be punished for not going along with these conversions, and there are also material incentives for going along with them. So I think I'm sort of more interested really in thinking about what the labels do, what the labels allow people to do, and how people slot themselves into those different categories, rather than any kind of argument about like how did they genuinely feel. I just don't think I can get to that with my sources. And this, as I said, sort of relates to that first question about the different terms that were used. I can't speak to all the different languages and like how the different languages conceived of these different groups, but I think that idea about the shift between Ruthenian and Ukrainian in Polish is a really good example of these labels being used in sort of instrumental ways to signify and to sort of justify certain types of political policies toward these groups.
Some more questions have come in. So now we're going to ask you to sort of look across the border to the east. Mm-hmm. One question has specifically to do with the railroads that were running through this area. During the war, the Germans converted the Polish railroad to standard gauge and added lines for military purposes. And as the Germans and Russians fought and finally retreated, they destroyed large portions of the lines. How much did the destruction and the slow rebuild of the railroads lead to an isolation and perhaps even distrust among the ethnic groups in this area? That's one question. Another question is asking you to elaborate on the impact and/or interactions with Soviet nationality policy, mm-hmm. a countermodel across the border to what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, these are great. So in terms of the railroad question, and Jovana, how much time do I have? Because I don't want to keep people beyond how long we're supposed to have.
Yeah, technically, we have 5 more minutes.
Okay.
And we do have a couple other questions, but let's see. Why don't you just respond to these first?
Okay, I'll try and do so as briefly as I can. So thank you for this this information about the railroads. That's much more detailed than I actually knew about. So I'm really grateful to sort of have that information. What I will say is that this area, and I'm not quite sure how this would correspond with the information that you've just given me, but this area was seen as both sort of isolated from Warsaw. It's not that far from Warsaw. I think the largest town is 500 miles from Warsaw, the largest town in Valinia. But it took in the early 1920s 12 hours to get there, right? So there is a sense that across the whole of Poland that the railroads don't quite work anymore because they've obviously been part of 3 different empires, and sort of to then glue all that together in a sense that the railroads is a kind of a good metaphor for all of the other problems that come from trying to lump different places together. So it is isolated, and part of that is an issue about infrastructure. And there's also a complaint, and this is sort of tangentially related, but that the stations that they've built, the railroad stations that the Russian imperial authorities built, are really, really far away from the towns. So, there's a railroad station with the name of a town, but actually it's like 3, 4, 5 miles outside of the town. And some places are just not connected at all. And so there's this, again, it's this sense that they've inherited a place where the infrastructure works for the empire, but it doesn't work for what the Poles want to. And something like railroads, which are obviously expensive to change and to build. And for a state like Poland, which is a pretty poor state, this is really a problem, and sort of, it's both metaphorical, but it's also a real problem for creating this new state. So thank you for that, for the question about railroads. how it corresponds to Soviet nationality policy. I mean, this is something that has been written about, right? And obviously Timothy Snyder's book on Valinia really focuses on the ways in which Józefski, who's the provincial governor for that middle period that I've been talking about today, is trying to create a kind of counter model to the Soviet model. So, you know, trying to encourage Ukrainians to think that Poland is a kind of, can provide a kind of home for them, versus what, you know, and obviously there's something kind of similar, but within the communist framework going on the other side of the border. So I would say, it's, you know, I certainly agree with that idea that they're competing in many ways, particularly those who want to include Ukrainians in this Polish idea, you know, civic national idea, that they're competing for Ukrainians with the Soviet model. But they do it very differently. You know, the Soviets sort of they sort of remap the space. They you know, Francine Hirsch has written about the ways in which they created new units to sort of revolutionize this, and in a sense to kind of create a Ukrainian nation. And the Polish idea is really quite different. It's much more based in history. It's much more based on the idea that you go back to previous units like Valinia, which, as I said, kind of has this history in that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that you kind of return to the idea of Ukrainians and Poles having lived alongside one another for a really long time. At the same time, the one thing that I see is similar. I see very different conceptions of what a nation is in these two cases, but they're both obsessed with things like, you know, as I said, sort of things that are not overtly political. So they're both obsessed with, I mean, they are political, but you know, things like building sewage systems, you know, these sort of technocratic projects to make citizens more civilized, to try and, you know, create a border that is actually sealed. I mean, these are things that both the Soviet Union and Poland are doing. And I attribute this primarily to the fact that they're both modernizing states, and that modernizing states just do certain things. So different in terms of their conceptions of the nation, I would say almost entirely, but in some ways doing really similar kind of projects.
We are right at time. I don't know if you have a moment, Kathryn, just to address another question that came in about the current state of affairs in this region that you studied historically. How diverse is it, and what are the relations like among the different groups? I know that's perhaps unfair because it's asking you to speak about the contemporary period, but, you know, in closing, if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, well, that I'm certainly not an expert on you know, what's happening in this region at the moment. And, you know, I went there to do some research. So, you know, I did a lot of the research initially in Warsaw, which obviously has a lot of documents from the interwar period about this region, but so many of the actual documents about this period in the interwar period are actually in Ukraine. So I did go there to do some research, but that was kind of a while. It's almost 10 years ago since I went to do that research, and I haven't been to Ukraine since then. So I can't really offer a sort of on the ground, you know, now perspective of what's happening. I think maybe the thing that I can speak to a little bit is the sort of memory of this in this area, and the, you know, what's still there and what's been erased. And, you know, one of the things that I wanted to do by going there was not only to access these archives that they don't have copies of in Poland, but also because I wanted this sort of really on the ground perspective about the interwar period, to actually go to some of these places and get a sense of the layout and the space, of course, knowing that things have changed, you know, with the communist period and so on. So it wasn't exactly the same, but I wanted to go and sort of experience some of these places. And I think, you know, it's very different from going somewhere like, you know, Lviv in Galicia, which really in some ways sort of celebrates its Habsburg past, and also has those sort of, there are like Polish coffee shops in Lviv, and there's a sort of nostalgia for certain period, this sort of Habsburg period, but even in some ways for the kind of former Polish presence there. And there are lots of Polish tourists in a place like Lviv. Valinia is different. You know, it doesn't have that same sense of, because it wasn't part of the Habsburg Empire, it doesn't have that same sort of nostalgia for that past. There are fewer, you know, there's fewer Polish influences here than in a place like Lviv. And one thing that I did want to do was to to go to see the Jewish sites of the town and to see how what was left. And so, to see where I was lucky enough to have a local guide, a historian, who kind of showed me those sites. And they're often sort of buried within the urban landscape. The synagogue was used, I think it was being used as a gymnasium when I was there. And there's a graveyard, but it's sort of pretty, it was, at least then, it was in a pretty poor state of affairs, and wasn't really being looked after. So I think, I can't really speak to the politics of the region, but at least last time I was there, I felt that a lot of the memory of the places that the communities that I was looking at had really been lost, and there was not really very much at that time, at least, being done to try and make that a part of the kind of memory of the places.
Well, I think we can thank you for, in so many ways, keeping our awareness and knowledge and memory of these issues and these times alive through your work. And so thank you so much for sharing it with us today. It is really lovely to have you visit our center, even from afar. I know I'm joined by the other attendees and participants in expressing gratitude for having you share your work, and really for the wonderful project that you've done. So thank you.
Thank you, Yovana, and thank you, everybody. I know I can't see everybody, but thank you, all of you out there, for attending and for all of your questions.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.